Hello everyone, my name is Grace Venneberg and I will be discussing the author Roald Dahl. Roald Dahl's early childhood. He was born in Llandaff, Wales, to two Norwegian parents named Harold Dahl and Sophie Magdalene Hesselberg. He had 6 siblings, and every time his mother and his father were pregnant, they would go on these glorious walks, Roald Dahl's father would call them, and he believed that when his wife were taking these walks with him, the beauty of the nature would somehow soak into through her eyes and then transfer the beauty into their unborn child. So when the child was born, it would be a lover of beautiful things. So Roald Dahl's siblings all had those glorious walks at some point. And there was a very sad, tragic death that occurred for Roald Dahl and his family, and that was the oldest daughter named Astrid. She died of appendicitis, and they did not have penicillin back then, so she died because of the appendicitis. And because of this death, it not only greatly influenced Roald Dahl, but it greatly influenced his poor father. And his poor father loved Astrid the most out of all of his children, so he was very heartbroken, and his heartbroken led to him not taking care of his body to the point where he illed his own self with pneumonia. And pneumonia, again, could not have been saved with penicillin because it was not around. And the only way to fight off pneumonia was by fighting for your own life, which he no longer cared to live for. So he did die, all within this couple of weeks. His father died and his older sister died. So his mother, Sophie, had to take on both parenting roles. And the main thing that concerned her was the education for her children. Roald Dahl's father, Harold, always believed that these children should get an English education because England was the great empire at that time, and many great authors and great literature came from that country. So Roald Dahl's schooling would soon begin. Roald Dahl's life experiences really influenced a lot of his writings. The first great influence was the dead mouse in the jar. When Roald Dahl was a little boy going back and forth to kindergarten, he passed by a candy sweet shop with a lot of his buddies. Well, inside this candy sweet shops, there was lots of beautiful and delicious candies. Their favorite were gobstoppers, which would soon be one of the candies in his book, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And these gobstoppers were the favorites of all the boys. And however, there was a very mean, gross, and rude lady who ran the sweet shop, and she was very abusive to the boys. So the boys one day found a dead mouse in the store and played a trick on the old lady, and Roald Dahl put the mouse himself into one of the gobstopper candy jars so that it would scare the old lady. Well, the next day they waited, and they passed by the sweet shop, and there was a broken jar of gobstoppers on the ground with the dead mouse on the floor as well. They went to school terrified. They thought that something terrible must have gone wrong with their prank, and they would soon find out what happened to that older lady. So that would inspire, the gobstoppers would inspire the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So that dead mouse in the jar inspired Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Now, Mr. McCombs, the giant. Now, Mr. Combs was seen as a giant because he was the headmaster at Roald Dahl's kindergarten school. And he was a very mean man. Well, when they got to school after the dead mouse incident, everyone had to be lined up. And the old lady was there with the giant Mr. Combs, and she pointed out Roald Dahl and all of his buddies, and they went into Mr. Combs' office, and they got a discipline of their lives. They got whacked with a cane very hard, very mean, to where the point of their body had black and blue marks from the hitting of them. So very abusive view of some of the teachers. So there was Mr. Combs the Giant, and he would influence his writings in the BFG because of the children eating giants in his story at that time. And the next influence was the matron, who would later inspire the idea of Miss Trunchbull in the book Matilda. The matron was at Roald Dahl's junior high school called Repton, and she was a lady not to be messed with, which a lot of boys did do to her. And she did not tolerate any nonsense or foolish business, and actually Roald Dahl accounted one of the moments where he was most terrified of her was when a little boy next to him in this boarding school was snoring at the night time. And the teacher grabbed some soap flakes and actually poured them into the poor boy's mouth because snoring was very ungentlemanly. And the boy was actually choking on his own bubbles that he made from the soap flakes. So that was a very terrifying, another abusive moment that Roald Dahl experienced while he was at school. So the matron would inspire Miss Trunchbull in his writings. And then finally, there is the Cadbury chocolate. This was actually a great influence for Roald Dahl, and again, it happened at Repton School where the matron was involved as well. But at this school, Cadbury's chocolate factory, the candy company, actually sent chocolate to the school for the boys to try and be taste testers for chocolates. So Roald Dahl got to experience that, and this would greatly influence and actually start the idea of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So those are just some of Dahl's life experiences that greatly influenced his works. Some of Roald Dahl's interests during school: he was very good at sports because he didn't really care for school because of all the abusive teachers. And he was also a great photographer. This picture right here is actually one that he would be taking when he was in World War II, and that is a famous arch in Egypt, and he actually won an award for that picture. So he was very good at sports, and he loved photography. Roald Dahl's education, like I said, he started at Landolph's Cathedral School, which was his K4, K5 school, and then he went to St. Peter's Weston Supermare School, and that was basically his elementary time. And then he went to Repton, which was the school where his junior high and high school would be. And they were all good English boarding schools, and he experienced a lot of, as you can see, a lot of cane action for discipline. So that was where a lot of his influence and his works would come from, and caused a lot of villains actually to occur for his writings. He did not go to college, however. Because of all the education that he had and all the experiences from the schools, he decided, no more, I'm good with it. So he did not go to college. Instead, he worked at an oil company in Africa for 3 years. Some important dates to remember: he was born September 13th, 1960, and he started to write in 1961. His famous book, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, was published in 1964, and he wrote many books during that time as well. And then his death was November 23rd, 1990. And then in 1991, his last children's book was published, and that was called The Mini Pippins. Some of Dahl's awards and accomplishments: he was a spy. During World War II, he actually enrolled as in Royal Air Force, and he was a great pilot. He shot down many German enemy planes, and during that time, he was actually considered a spy because he gave some valuable information to MI6 during that time of the war. So he was a spy, he was a great ace pilot, and he was a chocolate historian going back to his schooling days. He got to experience a lot of Cadbury chocolate and was a taste tester of chocolate at that time. And then he was also a medical inventor. This was actually a very sad cause for this to happen. His youngest boy, actually when they were living in New York City, got hit by a taxi cab and had serious brain damage. And this brain damage caused the fluids in his brains to go all malfunction. So his invention was actually aided with a lot of help of the doctors, but his invention was a Wade Dahl till shunt, and that was just a tube that helped give the proper fluids for his brain to function, for his son's brain to function correctly. So he was actually involved with that invention. He was also an award-winning photographer. We went back to that photograph of the arch in Egypt. He actually won an award for that picture. And then, he was a great children's storyteller. Number one in our modern day history of children's literature. And finally, on to his famous books, we have the first one, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And it's one of his most famous works. He sold over 20 million copies in over 55 different languages. And then the next book would be the BFG. The BFG actually won the Federation of Children's Book Group Award in 1982, and it was his own personal favorite. And then we have James and the Giant Peach, which was written in 1961, and that was his first classic novel for children. So that was when he first began writing, was 1961, so that was actually his first book that he published. And then we have Matilda. Matilda won the Children's Book Award in 1988 as well, and it was Roald Dahl's last long children's book. And then Mr. Fantastic Fox. This was just a story that was inspired by him and his family living on some property, and there was this old tree, and inside this old tree, he believed that there would be these small family of foxes. So those are just some of his famous works. He wrote many famous works. The Critique. Many of his books are very unsentimental and dark humor. For example, the book that I'll be reading is the BFG, and in the BFG there are children eating giants. And these children eating giants say that, depending on which country you're in, each child tastes differently. For example, a child who lives in Turkey will taste like turkey. So they would eat those children with a side of gravy. So that's just kind of the dark and unsentimental humor that Roald Dahl has in some of his works. Another flaw or disadvantage to his works are that adults are villains, but that's just because many of his books, again, are written in children narratives. So children do see things a lot differently, and based on his life experiences, a lot of adults were the villains. They were really mean and very cruel to him. So he has adult villains, and a lot of his books are written by the children narrative, which can be good sometimes because it does help with your students reading to, relating to those children in the books. However, good always does win in his books. There is a defined good and there is a defined evil, and good always triumphs over evil in Roald Dahl's books. And then finally, his books do teach children about being brave. In the BFG, Sophie has to be brave against these 9 man-eating giants, and she does a very good job at that. She stands in for what she believes in, and she also had to be brave actually going forth in front of the Queen of England. That takes a lot of courage. And another example would be James and the Giant Peach. He had to be brave against the rhino that was haunting him, and he showed his bravery by standing up against the rhino. So you can kind of go along with that in teaching that you are to have courage and that you are to be strong, just like the Bible says in Joshua, be strong and have good courage. That is another way that you can kind of teach in a lesson with some of Roald Dahl's works. I would steer away from the books that have the adults as villains, so like Matilda, just for the younger ones at least. But for the younger ones, the BFG, which has the defined evil and the defined good, and the bad guys are the evil giants. That is basically what I would try to read for the younger ones at least. But for older children, just use your own discernment. I'm sure that they can see the defined evil and the defined good, and that they can learn how to be brave through those books. So with that in mind, we'll go into the BFG by Roald Dahl. and I will go ahead and introduce that book to you guys.